In the previous study, we discovered that the king of the north represents modern-day Babylon, otherwise known as the papacy or Romanism. And we also saw that the king of the south represents atheism or secularism. We saw that at the end of time, secularism would supplant Romanism as the power of choice in today's world. However, eventually atheism and secularism will be defeated, and the papacy driven by Romanism will once again regain control of the world. But how will this happen? How can a change this drastic take place? Daniel 11 answers that question, and today we're going to look at verse 40 to start building the picture for how everything is going to go down. Since we already know that the king of the north is Romanism and the king of the south is secularism, let's go ahead and read Daniel 11 verse 40 and use those words. It says that Romanism will come against secularism like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. Question: does the papacy have chariots, horsemen, and many ships? Obviously not. The nations of the world don't fight with chariots and horsemen anymore, and if they tried, it would obviously be an absolute disaster. So why would God inspire Daniel to write about horsemen and chariots when he's talking about the end of time, when we have machine guns, fighter jets, and tanks? Don't miss this. As Daniel is being inspired to write, it has to make some kind of sense to the readers of his day and throughout time. So here's the secret to understanding what this means. We simply need to figure out what the whirlwind, chariots, and horsemen meant to Daniel and for ancient Babylon, and then we'll know what it means for modern-day Babylon. And one of the ways that we can interpret these symbols is by reading Jeremiah verses 7 and 13, which says, "The lion is come up from his thicket, and the destroyer of the Gentiles is on his way. He is gone forth from his place to make the land desolate, and thy cities shall be laid waste without an inhabitant. Behold, he shall come up as clouds, and his chariots shall be as a whirlwind. His horses are swifter than eagles. Woe to us, for we are spoiled." And there we have it. The same language used in Daniel 11 verse 40 is used in Jeremiah. The chariots, the whirlwind, the horses, who obviously require horsemen, are all mentioned in both places. What we are seeing in these verses is a description of ancient Babylon as they prepared for their conquest of the nations. Jeremiah refers to Babylon as a lion, just like Daniel also saw Babylon as a lion in Daniel chapter 7. As ancient Babylon was conquering, their military strength was highlighted by Jeremiah with horses and chariots, and the swiftness of their conquest is also highlighted as a whirlwind. This ancient conquest serves as a sort of parable for how the conquest of modern-day Babylon, or the modern-day king of the north, is going to take place. You can also find this symbol in Habakkuk chapter 1, which refers to the Babylonians as the Chaldeans. It says, "For lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land, to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity shall proceed of themselves. Their horses also are swifter than the leopards, and more fierce than the evening wolves. And their horsemen shall spread themselves, and their horsemen shall come from afar. They shall fly as the eagle that hasteth to eat." Again, we find a reference to the military strength of Babylon in the symbol of horses and horsemen. All of these symbols point to the same thing, the conquest of ancient Babylon, and it gives us a hint into how the conquest of modern-day Babylon, or the modern-day king of the north, is going to take place. This lets us know that what we are seeing in Daniel 11 represents a scenario that will soon come about that sees modern-day Babylon conquering through military or secular power. But wait a minute. If you look at the Vatican City, there are soldiers and guards. However, just by looking at them, I think it's fair to say that there is not enough military power there to conquer the world. However, based on what we saw in installment 1 of this series, during the Dark Ages, the papacy never conquered through using their military strength, but rather they conquered by utilizing the strength of the surrounding nations. And this is exactly what is happening in Daniel 11, which will become more clear when we look at Daniel 11 verse 43. When the deadly wound is healed, the papacy will once again have access to the military strength of the nations around the world, and they will use this power to enforce the mark of the beast. But it's not just military strength that will be used to reinstate the principles of Romanism. There's one more symbol in Daniel 11 relating to the power and influence that Romanism will soon exert over the world, and that symbol is ships. So, once again, let's find out what ships meant to Daniel in order to understand what it means to us today. In Scripture, ships were used for various things, including for purposes of war, but the overwhelming use of ships in the Bible was for the transport of goods to be bought and sold. Much like cargo ships, freight trains, and 18-wheeler trucks in our day, ships were used to move goods back and forth for commerce. Take these verses for example. 2 Chronicles chapter 9 verse 21. For the king's ships went to Tarshish, and the servants of Hiram. Every 3 years once came the ships of Tarshish, bringing gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. How about this one? Psalms 107 verse 23. They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters. Proverbs 31 verse 14. She is like the merchant ships. She brings her food from afar. And I can't help myself. Let's look at one more. Surely the isles shall wait for me, and the ships of Tarshish first, to bring thy sons from far, their silver and their gold with them, unto the name of the Lord thy God, and the Holy One of Israel, because he hath glorified thee. Gold, silver, ivory, apes, peacocks, and in the case of the last verse, the ships were used to bring their sons from afar. And if you didn't catch it, this represents labor. What we are seeing in these verses are goods and services, merchants and business. In 2 Chronicles, the ships had gold, silver, apes, and peacocks, also known as animals or beasts. And in Revelation 18, it's exactly the same. The merchants are there, the merchandise is there, even the chariots are there. This sounds eerily similar to what we find in Revelation 18 that talks about modern-day Babylon being connected with the merchants of the earth, being involved in the merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones and beasts and sheep and horses and chariots and slaves and souls of men. And finally, we see that every shipmaster and all the company in ships and sailors and as many as trade by sea stood afar off. It should be evident that the ships in Daniel 11 represent business and commerce. So what does this all mean? The chariots, horsemen, and ships, which represents secular power and commerce. What we have here is a snippet of what is found in Revelation 13. The papacy is coming, and they will be coming with the power to enforce the mark of the beast, with secular power over business, which says that men will not be able to buy or sell, and they will have power to compel men to receive the mark of the beast by threatening them with death. And in order to do this, they will have to have power over the military strength of the nations of the world, just as they had in the Dark Ages. And in Daniel 11, it says, all of this will happen with a whirlwind. As we already saw, when ancient Babylon was preparing for their attack, the prophet Jeremiah declared, behold, he shall come up as clouds, and his chariots shall be as a whirlwind. His horses are swifter than eagles. Woe unto us, for we are spoiled. Jeremiah was told to make ye mention to the nations, behold, publish against Jerusalem. In other words, Jeremiah was called to warn all the nations because everyone was going to be involved in this coming whirlwind. This is no different from what we're seeing in Daniel 11 verse 40, as it says that the king of the north will eventually enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. That phrase, enter into, overflow, and pass over, is a description of a power embarking on a worldwide conquest of domination of all countries, or I could say every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. And so it's important that we understand that God has called us to warn the world about the turmoil that's about to take place in our world as the King of the North makes his return like a whirlwind to regain what he has lost. Daniel 11 verse 40 is simply letting us know that modern-day Babylon will eventually take control of and utilize the power of the secular nations of the world. In order to enforce the mark of the beast, they must necessarily have the political and judicial authority to pass laws and the military and financial authority to enforce laws. This is what Daniel saw in the symbols of the chariots, ships, and horsemen. It should be clear that what he saw is accurate and will happen when God chooses to allow it. Babylon's goal is to stamp out secularism, which is the ideology of the separation of church and state, and replace it with Romanism, which is the ideology of the union of church and state. And when it happens, just like a whirlwind, it will be quick, it will be swift, and the final movements will be rapid ones. In the next episode, we're going to take a look at verse 41 of Daniel 11 and get even more detail of how this is going to happen. So, I hope to see you again in the next installment of Daniel 11 in 7.